Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to our Global Health Week. If you were wondering why we were starting a little bit late, we had an event next door on governance and financing, and a whole group from there has moved over here together with me. This is part of the Global Health Week, that there's a whole range of events here at the Graduate Institute that give a broader perspective beyond the obviously necessary issue-focused discussion at the World Health Assembly itself. So I hope you will be able to benefit from that. And of course, while the member states are busy taking some other decisions right now, we thought, we could offer you something to do so you don't get bored. So first of all, let me say thank you very much to Suri Moon, who has prepared this session. She has joined us recently here at the Graduate Institute at our Global Health Center, and one of the foci of her work is related to the governance of access to medicines. And so those of you that have worked with us for longer will find that we will be focusing on this issue more and more, and we hope to be able to contribute to that. That's all the more important because innovation and access to medicine is changing as we speak. It used to be an issue for developing countries, no longer. Just think of hepatitis C and all the discussions around that. So here we now have a truly global issue of concern for high, middle and low income countries, depending how we want to accept that kind of classification. But in terms of governance as a policy concern, we have to see that the old North-South divisions of politics are not that applicable. And the more that also pharmaceutical, generic industries, etc., grow in the developing world, we will see quite a new type of discussion emerging that we will have to look at carefully. And that, by the way, was a key issue when we were discussing the G20 Declaration of Health Ministers around antimicrobial resistance, issues of delinkage, and others. There is also, at the same time, in global health governance, an increased interest in transparency. We're looking at an increasing number of innovative processes. We're trying to find new ways to do global health, and we're trying to find new ways to approach the pricing of medicines. And therefore, we want to understand better what is actually going on. And that transparency is, of course, a key issue that will also be addressed today. Transparency can mean many things. It's complex. And again, there are many, many different types of information that come together when we look at transparency. And again, then the question arises, what are the policy implications? Transparency usually goes with accountability. So the question is, transparency for what? Accountability to whom? And we hope to be able to discuss more of that. And so, as I've said, our focus is on governance, and we want to understand better the governance of access to medicines and want to try and explore and unpack, if I can call it that, some of that complexity today. I also want to mention that we're delighted to be collaborating with FIND. On this occasion, in full transparency, I'm on the board of FIND, and those of you that deal with diagnostics will know that FIND has moved forward considerably over the last 3 to 5 years, really changed its focus and become part again of a larger global health debate around governance and access. So without further ado, you will get to meet Suri in a little while when we move to the panel. But at this stage, I would like to introduce Tenu Avavia, who is from the HIV Health and Development Group from the UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme. He is the team leader of the Human Rights Law and Treatment Access team there, and he will set the scene for this issue of transparency and access. So, where is he? There he is. Okay. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start by thanking the organizers of this important and well-attended, considering what's happening up the road, side event. I've been asked by the organizers to say a few words on behalf of UNDP, which served as the secretariat for the high-level panel on access to medicines, in summarizing some of the key findings and recommendations, and then to unpack in a little bit more detail some of the transparency-related recommendations. And I was also told that I have about 10 minutes to do that, so without much ado, I'll get started. So there's a display screen here, and I can see my slides, but okay, now you can too, which is good. So, it's no news or surprise to anyone in this room that about 18 months ago we had 193 member states of the United Nations adopt the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which includes the 17 standalone goals, the SDGs, including SDG 3, A Healthy Life for All, very ambitious goal. That same year, we also had more than 1.1 million people dying of AIDS-related illnesses. There were some 10.5 million tuberculosis infections and 1.8 million deaths from TB, and that was actually the first time that TB deaths overtook HIV deaths. We had 1.5 million deaths from hepatitis, viral hepatitis at least. In the field of neglected tropical diseases, more than 1.5 billion people who needed preventative chemotherapy for at least one of the major NTDs worldwide. About a third of those people did not receive, so about 500 million people did not receive that chemotherapy. And then there's a small matter of the NCDs, the four major ones which account for about 60% of global deaths. So on the one hand, we have this wonderful political commitment. On the other hand, we have a very sobering public health situation. And how do we square this up? I think this was partly the reason behind the Secretary General, merely 2 months after the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, to establish a high-level panel on access to medicines. And if you look at the terms of reference of this high-level panel, they were asked to do a few things. They were asked to seek alignment or to reconcile the public health figures that we just looked at, the international right to health, as enshrined in numerous international treaties from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights onwards, and as enshrined in 100 constitutions, national constitutions worldwide, the rights of inventors in the context of the SDGs. And this is a photo of the former Secretary General with the two co-chairs of the high-level panel, Madame Dreyfus and Rā Mogai, the former presidents of Switzerland and Botswana, respectively. The other gentleman in the photo is Michael Kirby, who was a member of the panel and also chaired its expert advisory group, and it's good to see a few members of the expert advisory group in the room. So I won't speak much about process in the 7 minutes I have left, except to say that from when the announcement was made to when the report was delivered was an extremely compressed and intense 10-month period. And the report was given to the Secretary General on September the 13th and released a day later. It's a short report. I see a few copies in the room. It's about 25 pages in length, with about 30 recommendations. And it's divided into 4 chapters. The last one is what I'll be speaking a little bit more about: governance, accountability, and transparency. And it's very interesting that was the framing of the discussion by the previous speaker, because transparency for what purpose? It's to hold certain duty bearers accountable. And that's why transparency was discussed together with accountability and transparency in the high-level panel report. Right, so what are the key touching points, if I may? The first one, I think, is that when the high-level panel undertook its inquiry, it found that the lack of sufficient transparency across various aspects of the value chain, of the innovation value chain, was a challenge. For instance, the age-old question of how much does it cost to produce a drug was one that the panel grappled with. And in undertaking its research, it saw a very wide array of numbers, ranging from the often cited $2.5 to $2.8 billion amount, which you find in the Tufts study, to the DNDi amount, which ranges from 130 to 195 million, based on R&D investments that DNDi itself has undertaken, and that amount adjusted to include the cost of failure in some cases in innovation, which we all know happens. And so I don't think the panel was as perplexed by the lack of an accurate number, because we all know that depending on the complexity of the health technology at question and the disease, that number will vary. But what puzzled the panel was just how much the number varied between the DNDi study, for instance, and some of the industry-backed studies. So that was one concern. And in digging further into that, the panel found that while publicly funded or public companies who are listed are somehow expected during the annual reports to disclose their returns and also the investments and the expenditure, there's of course no such obligation on public companies, on private companies rather. And even when information around the R&D costs is available, it's sometimes very difficult to disaggregate or distinguish between actual R&D and, say, marketing or distribution related costs. We also found that R&D costs are often not broken down by product or by source and are very rarely listed precisely. So for instance, you struggle to find information about the cost of a specific product development. You also struggle to find detailed information about how much of a tax break, how much of a subsidy, or how much of a grant was given to a specific health technology. So these are things that the panel grappled with. The panel did note that there are a number of important databases around pricing, which of course was the other concern around transparency of information, including the V3P rather, and the Health Action International and MSF databases, but that these were incomplete. And also the information that was available for these databases often did not, as I was saying, factor in information around markups and taxes and arrangements, and there are many arrangements between suppliers and procurers, as we know. So with that in mind, the panel made a couple of recommendations, and I think I've got a couple of minutes left to go through these. The first set pertained to R&D and pricing. And the panel was very, I think, clear in saying that governments should require, and there the duty bearer was governments. Government should require the manufacturers, and that includes originator and generic manufacturers of vaccines, diagnostics, of biosimilars, of biologics and drugs, to disclose to the procurers and to the regulators the cost of R&D, including clinical trials, the cost of marketing, the cost of distribution, as well as any public funding that was received during the innovation process, so that government authorities can better determine whether they got fair value for the investment. As far as pricing information is concerned, the duty bearer there identified by the high-level panel was WHO. And we know that WHO has databases already, including the Global Price Reporting Mechanism. The panel felt that this was a starting point and could be used to expand to include information around other diseases as well as other health technologies. And of course, this information could only be recorded by WHO if it is made available. So I think there's a corresponding duty. And then there were a set of recommendations around transparency concerning clinical trials and patent information. And here the governments were essentially asked to require that data around clinical trials, whether the trial has been concluded or not, whether the findings of the trial, the clinical trial, are positive, negative, or inconclusive, need to be made publicly available. And again, there already are sites, databases where some of this information is publicly available, but the panel felt that this needed to be done in a much more systematic manner. And then finally, transparency around patent information, which I think has come a long way, certainly in the HIV and hepatitis space, thanks to the medicines patent pool. But again, the panel felt this was a starting point that could be expanded upon with collaboration by governments and the involvement of WIPO to include information around the standard international common names for biologics, international non-proprietary names for pharmaceuticals, as well as the dates of patent application, grant, and expiry. So that's my job this afternoon to, I think, lay the ground for what should be a very interesting discussion. And I plan to sit in the front row, sit back, and listen to a lively debate. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tanu. Could I invite our 5 panelists to come and join me on the stage, please? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Suri Moon. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first World Health Assembly as a member of the Global Health Center team, and it's a very exciting and dynamic place to be, as you all are attesting. Please come and have a seat.
Is there any order?
Yes, I mean, you can sit in any order, and I'll call on you in the specified order. Thanks. So we're very excited to have an all-star panel with us today to discuss and explore this issue of transparency, which is, as Ilona was mentioning, a very complex issue. What I wanted to do was just to remind everybody that there has been a lot of increased interest in transparency recently within policy debates, in public debates, within academia, and even within some measures of proposed legislation in a number of countries. Just about 10 days ago, I saw a number of your faces in Amsterdam, where we had the Fair Pricing Forum, jointly organized by the government of the Netherlands and the WHO, where transparency was one of the major themes that emerged and was debated. Those discussions focused quite a bit on transparency of prices and research on development, which were a number of the recommendations that you just heard about from the high-level panel on access to medicines. What we'd like to do is include those topics today, but also expand a bit the scope of the types of information that we're going to be discussing. And so we're going to have a number of our speakers addressing transparency of pricing, R&D costs, yes, public and private contributions, clinical trial data, patent information, et cetera. And we're also going to hear from 2 speakers on what are the implications of some of these transparency debates for those who are doing research on development, industry, and PDPs. So I think we're going to have a really terrific time. What we'd like to do is explore the questions of what are the benefits of increased transparency, what are the risks of increased transparency, how do they compare to the benefits, and what action might need to be taken to actually make progress on both innovation and access to medicines. Okay. So. What I will do is, can you all hear me? Yes? Great. Okay. I'm going to briefly introduce each speaker as we go, and what I'm going to do is ask each of the speakers, in fact, to respond to 3 questions, which they've been warned about in advance. What is the problem or the challenge at hand? How might increased transparency address the problem or not? And what action is needed now? So what we're going to do is begin with Dr. Clemens Auer. He's the Director General of the Ministry of Health of Austria. He's been deeply involved, in reforming Austria's healthcare system, and is also deeply informed, we're very happy to say. And he's getting ready to help the Austrian government assume the presidency of the European Union next year. And what we've done is, what we've asked Dr. Auer to do is to focus on the issue of pricing. In the current system, the prices of many medicines are usually kept confidential, often through contractual obligations. And the list price that we might be aware of, in the list price that's available in the public domain, may not in fact be an accurate reflection of the prices that governments are paying. Is this a problem? Is there more transparency needed in this area or not? And if so, then what might be some ways to actually get there? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm the ugly face of government here, obviously, on the podium. That's fine. I expected to have a Viennese coffee house table atmosphere here. No, the whole whole audience hall here. Fine. See, I'm a director general. I'm a director general of a ministry of a obviously rich country, and I only can tell you, and this is my simple message. We woke up and we all received, and even me, being a director general of a rich country, so to say, we woke up several years ago with this famous American product curing Hep C. You remember that? And even we woke up and said, no, friends, this is enough because this is so costly and there are other things in development that even our very well equipped and funded and staffed healthcare system is not able to sustainably be financed and afford this. So, my responsibility is not farmer pricing in nitty little gritty and negotiating with companies. My overall responsibility is to guarantee that the people in Austria, the patients, have a fair and good access to treatment, high quality treatment, and on the other hand, that this treatment is is feasible, is financeable. The sustainability of finances is very much on my agenda too. And see, I can tell you that the current development, and we have to face that, and once again, we woke up. The current development on the pharma sector, especially regarding innovation or so-called innovation, is not working anymore. There is no business case anymore, maybe for the pharmaceutical industry, but for us, the public health systems, there is no business case anymore. So this is not working anymore. So this is the key message I can prevail to you, and you might observe that, can I say so, we, the governments, at least in the European Union, we are reacting to that, and I'm very pleased that even the ministers, the highest political level, was able to agree last year on council conclusions set up by our Dutch friends, having the presidency, EU presidency back then. And I really would like to ask you to revisit these council conclusions last year by EBSCO, because this is a cookbook. This is really a cookbook for us, the governments, how we should deal with these questions, and not only pricing, there's much more than pricing on that. Excuse me, I'm a half politician, so I might get off track a little bit. But why I personally woke up is, I was sitting at an informal ministers' council 2 years ago, and next to me, and I won't tell you who it was, but there was a minister sitting from an EU member state. Next to me, a nice guy. And he was asking me, Clemens, I do need, and he named me 4 regular cancer drugs. I do need these drugs, 15 packages, to serve acute patients in his home country. And I said to him, sorry, in my basement in the ministry, I don't have that drugs, so I cannot UPS them to you. But I was able to put him up with a wholesaler so that he was able to receive it in a couple of hours. But this is a EU member state, actually a larger EU member state, I don't say more, where the access to simple, and it was not super expensive and super innovative cancer drug, is not available. So the market is not working. For me as Austrian, I never had these problems because all this stuff, so to say, is available on our market. So this shocked me so very much that I was saying then to my people at home, when we have the presidency, we really have to look in that closer. So let me get closer to what you actually asked me. I think it is impossible that we don't have clear price transparency on the market. We are a country which the pharmaceutical industry uses as a price maker country. There are several countries, and we're always among them. They use us to set the price. Why? Because we are stupid enough to accept the price. When I go to my neighbors, to Slovakia, Hungary, to Poland, the Visegrad countries or whatever, they always tell me, Clemens, you are the biggest traitor because you are ruining the price. And it took me a long time to understand what they are talking about. But industry is using us as price-setting markets, and then they might enter the other markets or not. So the market is not working. There is no reflection of the real cost of a product. There is no reflection. See, yes, there are databases, and one of my institutes back in Vienna is also a collaborating partner for WHO and tries to figure out the price differences or the prices. But there is no transparency because the discounted prices or whatever is not even listed there. Is not listed there. It's a list price, but it's not the real paid price for. So this is not working, friends. This is not working. This is not how we can be transparent and work. So the delayed launch in markets, as I said, big country, European country, not somewhere else, Europe. No access to innovation, no access to regular treatment. But I always, and this is also my political point here, I don't do only farmer bashing or market bashing. I always talk in the meantime, and when I look at this, that we have to recognize that there are market failures, yes, but there are at least as many policy failures also. So people like me, and I'm very honest, people like me made lots of mistakes in the last 10 or 15 years. Because we didn't care, we didn't look closer, we didn't analyze it. We accepted that we are working in fragmented markets. Now, slowly, we start reconsidering it. And, you have all heard about Benelux, this initiative, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Austria is starting because we are like-minded countries, GDP-wise, we are very comparable, so, it makes sense that we collaborate. We cannot collaborate with our German brothers because they don't follow, I don't know. But at least we can work with these countries. Why are we doing this? Because we have to enhance our market position vis-a-vis the industry. See, the industry, they work with their boardrooms, and their boardrooms make strategic decision, when and where they go into the market. We, the governments, we don't have a boardroom. So it is good that we at least started with Benelux having a boardroom, and also strategically try to counterbalance the market power of the industry, of the producers. That's what we try to do. You can look at us, maybe we succeed, maybe we fail. But, once again, it's not only market failures, it's also policy failures.
Thank you very much, Dr. Auer. One of the points you raised was that the price might not reflect the cost, and our next speaker is actually going to be speaking about R&D costs as well as public and private contributions to the R&D process. Jamie Love is known to many of you in the room. He's the director of Knowledge Ecology International, a very well-known expert on innovation policy, research and development, access to medicines, intellectual property, and one of the most creative thinkers, I would say, on how to solve difficult policy questions on knowledge generation and access. So there's very little public information about R&D costs, as Tanu was reminding us in his presentation, linked to a particular medicine or regarding medicines as a whole, even less information regarding relative public and private sector contributions. So I'd like to pose the same 3 questions to you, Jamie. What's the problem or challenge? How might increased transparency actually address the problem or not? And what action is needed now? Thanks.
Thank you, Suri, and thank you for the opportunity to be at the Graduate Institute today. The problem, as I see things, that at least that I'm focusing on lately, is the fact that drug prices are high, creating a stress on budgets of health authorities. They create problems for patients who sometimes cannot get the drug because the drug is priced too high, or have to pay for it out of pocket. So that's the problem I'm going to talk about. And so people have asked sometimes, why would transparency have anything to do with that problem? There's 2 conversations you hear out of the drug companies. One, you have to give us really big profit margins and high prices, because otherwise we won't invest money into R&D and you won't get new products. And then when you ask them, well, what are you spending on R&D? They say, well, our prices are not linked to what we spend in R&D. Let's not talk about that. So there's a contradiction between saying that it's the most, I mean, basically, if you think about it, there is no other, and I mean no other justification for high prices than it's supposed to act as an incentive to get people to do research and development. So if you have drugs that cost, in some cases, $1 million a year, $200,000 or $300,000, $150,000, over $30,000 for an HIV patient in the United States. These are drugs that can be manufactured practically the price of aspirin or ibuprofen. It's reasonable to ask if the prices are that high, and if people literally die in some cases because they can't have access to the drugs. If about 80% of the world's population is out of the circle of access for the newest cancer drugs, for example, it seems reasonable to ask, can we drill down a bit to see how this incentive system is working? For example, how much does the monopoly increase prices, and what do we get back from it in terms of what's actually invested? Now, if you look at just to the 10K level for R&D level, I started to look at this recently, and I noticed there was a $1.7 billion entry in a Bristol Myers 2015, I think, 10K report, where they booked as a R&D cost the cost of acquiring a compound from a third party as an asset allocation. And I saw another over $1 billion entry in I think it was a Pfizer spreadsheet that related to a marketing agreement. I really wasn't, I consider myself someone who's kind of up to speed on these things. I just hadn't paid attention to how much asset allocations are being booked and marketing agreements even are being booked as R&D cost on the 10K. So there's that. Then if you sort of drill down, people talk about this Damasi study. I know Joe, he's a very competent guy. Part of his job, though, is to sort of make the drug companies look good and to confuse people about what the data is, at least in my opinion. It's true that his study puts this most recent study that was quoted extensively before it was even published by the New York Times and everyone else. It's amazing to have such a reputation. You can actually get your number out there for about a year before anyone actually sees the paper itself. Most of us don't have that kind of publishing clout. And by the way, the numbers sort of burned into your brain before you have a chance to see how it's put together. People really don't already understand how much that was put together, but the basic data he uses is clinical trial data. And for example, he estimated there was an average of $255 million spent on phase 3 trials for drugs that were approved as novel drugs. $255 million is a really big number for phase 3 trials. So we wanted to look at cancer drugs, for example, and see how 255 million for phase 3 trials compared to what we could calculate was spent on drugs. So we looked at every single new cancer drug approved from 2010 to 2016. There was a novel drug, and there was 56 of them, 0 of which are on the essential drugs list, by the way. 0. Now, of these 56 drugs, 19 of them had 0 patients in phase 3 trials. So right there, I would sort of start subtracting the 255 million in the phase 3. And by the way, that 255 grows like Pinocchio's nose does, because you take the 255 and then an adjustment is made, first of all, for the risk of failure, and then a second adjustment for the theoretical capital cost. That's how you get up to $2.5 billion. But let's just take the 255 for a second. We looked at all of the 56 drugs. How many? What are you showing me there? 1 minute left. So we looked at the 56 drugs, and we used an estimate by Pharma and Battelle as to how much money they spent on oncology trials in the United States, which we believe is the high-end place for doing clinical trials. And then what we looked at is we looked at the enrollment, which was publicly disclosed in the FDA files of the medical review. So we had the enrollment from the FDA, things was a public document filed by the company. And then we had the pharma study of what they cost per patient, and we did a little math. We multiplied the number of patients on the one hand with what pharma says they spend per patient for oncology drugs for phase 3 trials. And we compared what we calculated they spent on phase 3 trials with the DeMasi average. And of the 56 drugs, 56 were below average. So right off the bat, even before you get to what the numbers are, not a single drug was higher than what he calculated as the average of samples. Then you might ask, well, what is the sample of the DeMasi thing? What drugs were in the sample? Well, that's a secret. Well, how many patients were in the clinical trials? Well, it turns out that's a secret too. Well, what's the per patient cost of the people in the trial? Also a secret. Then we looked at the issue of the orphan drug tax credit, which is a 50% tax credit for the cost of doing research. How many of the cancer drugs invented between 2010, registered between 2010 and 2016 qualified for the 50% subsidy on the cost of qualifying trials? That would be 75% of the 56 drugs. How much the credit was given? Well, that's actually secret too. You don't know what that is. And I could go on and on. I could talk about when we asked the NIH what they spent on clinical trials, they wouldn't tell us the information, even though they used to routinely publish this information 15 years ago. And used to be able to get it per drug, per trial from them. We cannot, from the NIH today, get details when they license an entire class of drugs to a company. They won't tell us, in some cases, the principles of the company, for a company that has no web page, certainly the term of the license, the royalty rate, or any of the other relevant provisions and things. The amount of transparency, you mentioned prices, there's very few things you can sell to the government where the price that you get from the government in a transaction is a secret. Pharmaceuticals is this exceptional no transparency zone. You can transfer an asset in the case of a patent license worth a couple of $2 billion, and it can be an absolute secret in the United States what the company even paid for that. And these are negotiated transactions, not part of some tender process.
So would more transparency be a good thing?
Well, I would say one last thing. Yes, it would. I think it would. It gives you more information so you can understand more of what's going on. But I think that people will talk about the access to knowledge things and being able to make it so the biologics more competitive when patents file, needing to have access on patent landscape. You can look at the paper that Judith Rios here and Rohit and Marcus Lowe and other people worked at the high-level panel, the range of things in transparency. I think what the WHO is a high-level resolution next year on transparency that deals with the wide range from data in clinical trials to cost of marketing cost to issues about R&D cost to know-how issues on manufacturing biologics drugs, patent lands, et cetera, everything you can possibly dream up in transparency. And blow-up transparency is a big meta issue. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. course, one of the cost components that you mentioned was clinical trials, and that's what our next speaker will be focusing on. Dr. Vasimurthy is the coordinator of research ethics and knowledge uptake at the World Health Organization, has also been the team lead for the recent R&D blueprint on epidemics, and has also himself been an actor and a coordinator of clinical trials and been involved in the development of many different products. Last week, WHO announced that a number of major research funders and international NGOs would be adhering to WHO recommendations regarding publication, timely publication, I should say, of clinical trial results. So this is a very opportune moment for us to revisit this topic of transparency of clinical trial, the existence of trials and their outcomes. And I was wondering, if you could let us know what is the problem, how might increased transparency help or not, and what action is needed now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siri. So I'm here to directly answer your questions, hopefully by the end of my 5 minutes, in inverted commas 5 minutes, it will be clear to you all that we have a big problem. This is one part of a much bigger transparency agenda in research. But what is somewhat attractive about this particular point is that there are fixes. It is not as complex as some of the other issues. And at WHO, through a big consultation process, we have a position and we have some proposed fixes. The interesting situation is that in this space, how do we implement the fixes? And what is it that has been holding up the fixes? Because this is not a new problem. It's been with us for several decades. So just to be really concrete, as you all know, clinical trials are absolutely central to much of the decision-making that we make in health. It cuts across what many of you do. So which drug should we use? Which vaccines should we use? How should we better implement, optimize delivery of the available interventions? How do we increase safety? How do we increase cost effectiveness? Because the effectiveness is what clearly a major driver of that. And if you're, say, in a government or a multilateral financing agency, what is the core package of interventions that you should be supporting? What information do you have on which interventions you should support with your limited budgets? If you're a doctor, you ask which drugs you should prescribe. So I used to be a jobbing doctor. I used to search for what the clinical trial information was on which drugs I should prescribe. If you're a patient, you want to know. If you're a patient, you also want to know which clinical trials you should enroll into because you might have a serious condition, say cancer. You want to know if you can extend your life, potentially cure your own condition. So all of these decisions are largely based on clinical trial information. So clearly, we have access to all of the crucial information from clinical trials. I mean, this must be the case. We must know which clinical trials have occurred, and we must have access to the results from all of the clinical trials, right? We don't. I mean, absolutely, we don't. And so the first people who first hear about this will find it tough to understand that we have really very little transparency in this space there. And how can this be in 2017? It is still the case. The good thing is that there is momentum. That we are seeing progress in multiple areas, but there are over 100 studies now. We're in the era of systematic reviews of publication bias and reporting bias, multiple systematic reviews. And these repeatedly show that on average, about half of the clinical trials remain unreported. It varies, and it's not an issue of industry versus non-industry. There are some industry entities that have decided to really be very progressive on the transparency side. As one example, GSK, who have the audits show that they are following their own transparency policy, but it's very patchy, the compliance in this area, and it's an issue of incentives. It's large trials and small trials. Some people maybe will say to me, well, surely this is mainly an issue with small trials. There are multiple studies that show if you look at large trials, that there's a large proportion of the large trials, even if you restrict this to phase 2 and phase 3 trials. If you add all of this up, it's not difficult to get to a point where you can show that over 1 million study participants have been enrolled in clinical trials over the last decades, the results of which have not been disclosed, and so we don't have any access to the information from those trials. There are several concrete examples of harms that have occurred, including deaths, and also, I think a very important point is that it leads to waste in if we have multi-billion-dollar, as we do, taxpayer-funded or foundation-funded research programs, if only, let's say, half, I mean, it's less than half to more than half, depending on exactly what the sector you're looking at is, let's say half. If only half of that information is actually available, then a lot of the funds that are going in to fund new clinical trials are being wasted because the answer actually, somebody knows the answer, it's just not out there. So people are now doing more trials to do something that we should already know the answer to. So at WHO, we ask for 4 relatively simple actions, and as Suri said, we have agreement, I think leadership shown by many leading research funders and international NGOs with a statement last week to follow these actions. So this is, I would say, for anybody engaged in clinical trials, one way or another, or anybody with influence over those engaged in clinical trials, whether you're a funder, a PI, a sponsor, a regulator, working with ethics committees, working in universities, which should have policies on this, in product development partnerships, in NGOs, or you could advocate this through patient organizations, professional or civil society organizations. So firstly, ensure that all clinical trials are prospectively registered in a WHO-compliant clinical trial registry. This is simple because we have a list on our website, ICTRP. Ghassan Karam, who runs this at WHO, is here, where we have international agreement on the standards for clinical trial registries. We have 17 that comply, so you can look at who.in/ICTRP. You can find one of the compliant registries. And that needs to be prospective. That's been our position since 2005. It's still not universally adhered to. Secondly, we need to ensure that as a minimum, a summary of the results are made publicly available with the clinical trial protocol, so we have the methods as well as the results within 12 months of the end of the trial. And we see 2 different modalities for this, journals, but also the results section of the registries. What not so many people know is that over 20,000 clinical trials have their results available in clinicaltrials.gov. So this is not new. It's been the legal requirement for a subset of clinical trials in the USA since 2007. Thirdly, endorse and support the development of transparent systems to monitor that results are made available so that we know who's conducting trials where and whether or not they're making them available. And then fourthly, ask, and I think this, if there was a single most cost-effective intervention in this space, it would be engage with anybody who might have clinical trial results from previously completed clinical trials and make them available. There is a whole big set of results and literature from what has been done in the past, sometimes decades ago. And some of that is actually just as important as information, or more important than information that may come out of trials that are starting now, because we are using drugs now, and the clinical trials that are unreported from the past have relevant information on for the safety and the effectiveness of those drugs and other products. So just to highlight the names of those groups that showed leadership by signing up to this statement last week. The main public funders of clinical research in India, so the Indian Council of Medical Research, the UK Medical Research Council, in France, INSERM, the main French government funder of clinical research, the Norwegian Research Council, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, CEPI, which is interesting because it's a new product development partnership, and I think if you're embarking on a new initiative, you have an opportunity to really get out ahead and leverage action by other groups in addition to yourself. So CEPI, a new group with over $500 million to fund emerging pathogen research, signed up, as well as PATH, the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, MSF, Epicentre, and Institut Pasteur. So all of these will be working on developing and implementing a policy in line with the above elements over the next 12 months. And finally, I think every one of you here in the audience could decide that you want to engage in whatever way you can. There are multiple ways that you can advocate for change. And I think together, I would hope that we get to a point where we look back on the current situation we're in now, where you can pick and choose which results you make available from the trials that you do. And we find it difficult to understand how we allowed this situation to continue for so long. You could use a lot of different analogies, but I think one example would be most of us live in democratic societies where we believe that individuals should be allowed to elect our government. And who would have believed that it was acceptable to restrict the choice for votes to half of the population to only men, which is the same proportion that we have, about half of the clinical trial results that we have available now. Why would you only allow men to make decisions about who gets selected to form part of your government? That was the case in the past. I hope in the future we look back on this current situation in the same way. And as I said, this can be fixed. There are relatively simple fixes. It's not complex. It's not a bad guys versus good guys thing. I don't see it that way. It's an issue of incentives, systems, and enforcement. And let's just to end on the point that some of what we're calling for is actually currently the law in the USA, in the EU. We have this interesting situation where whenever you do an audit, we see widespread non-compliance with the law. So it also is a risk mitigation strategy for any of you who would like to comply with the law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murthy. I like how you linked clinical trials transparency to women's right to vote. Here at the Global Health Center, we believe strongly in no all-male panels. And we hope not to see any more at this World Health Assembly. So I'm very delighted to introduce our fourth speaker, who is also a woman. Dr. Funmi Griego is the Assistant Director General of the IFPMA. Formerly, she was with Merck, with the US White House, and with pharma in Washington. She is a recent transplant to Geneva, like myself, but she is not new to these issues or to these debates. So as we just heard from Dr. Murthy, a number of transparency calls are actually made towards academic institutions, NGOs, research funders, but many of them are directed towards industry. What are the areas that you think it's actually most likely in which there might be some forward movement on these transparency calls? And again, what is the problem? What are the benefits and risks, as well as what are the next steps for action? Thanks very much. Perhaps you could.
Thank you very much. I feel like maybe I need a little bit more than 5 minutes to address all the issues that were raised, but I'm very glad to have the opportunity to represent the perspectives of the research-based industry. Of course, the core mission of IFPMA and our members is to do the research and development that's necessary for the new medicines that will bring about improvements to life of patients all over the world. And of course, today's branded medicines are tomorrow's generics. And so I think we really look at a long-term life cycle perspective to the products that we develop and the partnerships that we have with governments as well as other stakeholders. I think we do recognize the important role that the industry plays, not only in generating the health data related to these interventions, but also a number of health systems related information that is helpful in making sure that the right patients receive the right treatment at the right time. I think that's a shared objective of all of us, and I think we can work together to improve policies in order to deliver those results to patients. And I am proud of working for the research-based industry. We are an evidence-based organization, and we take the generation and dissemination of information very seriously. And we do set high standards for ourselves. Of course, we're also a highly regulated industry. There's a number of government regulations and policies that we do need to adhere to. But that said, we also do promote a number of transparency-related openness and a code of conduct through our IFPMA code, which all members, both companies and associations, need to adhere to. And so in recent years, I think we've made a number of steps to promote more transparency, particularly in the area of clinical trials. I think that's an area where we've made some progress in terms of getting a lot of information that may not have been readily accessible, available. Progress, of course, with anything new is maybe slower than we would like, but I think we've made a good progress in that respect. And so I think that's just to show that there is an openness to dialogue and to improve the way that we share information with all of our stakeholders. I think, to answer your question about what is the problem or challenge, I think, one thing that I'd like everyone to take away from this conversation is that context matters. There's a lot of complexities as well as a lot of different considerations when it comes to disclosure of information. And so what we have to balance from an industry perspective is the need to communicate the information that we do have, but at the same time, we are competitors. The companies that IFPMA represents are competitors, and we do need to promote that competition in order to achieve effective and efficient solutions to our many unmet needs in terms of patient health. And so I think, some of the considerations that we do have to remember are antitrust considerations, competition agreements. I think we do need to consider the confidentiality of the various partnerships that we enter into, not only with governments, but other stakeholders within the healthcare system. And so I think we do have to work through those kinds of issues. And again, context matter in terms of balancing what the right amount of disclosure is, the right type of information, and when we do that. And so for, speaking from my government experience, if you look at legislations at the national level, like the Freedom of Information Act, there's a recognition that there are confidential business information that needs to be protected in addition to patient privacy information. And so particularly when we get down to not just aggregate clinical data, but patient level data, I think there are a lot of companies who are trying to provide that kind of searchable databases and using different portals and partnerships to do that. But we do need to be careful that we are not inadvertently releasing information that is either sensitive from a privacy perspective or from a commercial perspective, making sure that we're disclosing it in a manner that does not undermine that competition that we need to promote. So with that, I think, another consideration that we need to think about in addressing, whether increased transparency will help. I think in the case of clinical trials, absolutely more information on public health issues is very helpful in order to achieve some of the common objectives of health system reform. How do we incentivize better outcomes, not pay for input into health sort of treatments, but really how do we incentivize prevention and the appropriate disease management to improve and reduce progression into other diseases. So I think from that perspective and that lens, there are information that's going to be helpful. But at the same time, if you look at sunk costs, if you will, of R&D. Now, I think it is important to understand the complexity of the R&D system because it is a great risk that our companies take in order to deliver new products. And in many ways, it is getting harder and harder to find that cure. So for instance, Alzheimer's disease. There are a number of hard to treat diseases now that we're trying to tackle. And necessarily, some of the research is unfortunately going to lead to products that are never launched. And we do not want to incentivize those kinds of results by paying for lost R&D. So I think we need to look at it more from a forward-thinking perspective of what does it take to incentivize the kind of unmet needs that need to be met in the future and ensure that the type of research that needs to go in to develop those treatments will be there in the future for future patients. And so I think there are a number of considerations with respect to prices of drugs, but I think it's important to remember that particularly in OECD countries, for a majority of them, it still represents 15% or less of overall healthcare costs. And the growth patterns are, even with the new innovations that are coming, are likely to keep it fairly stable in that area. Now, that's different in other countries, developing countries in particular. I think there is a higher proportion of spend on medicines, but why is that? Because there's not the healthcare financing in order to cover other interventions. So I think, again, context matters and making sure that whatever solution that we develop is targeted towards the problem that we're trying to address. And so if the problem is a lack of information, then absolutely transparency is the solution. But if the fundamental underlying problems that we're trying to address is from other sources, then additional information may not be the most effective or efficient way to go. So I think that's the overall, I think, lens that we need to put together. And so in terms of actions that we need now, I think we do need a conversation about what is it that we are trying to solve, and what is the most effective way to do that? And if, again, information is the best way to do it, let's work through some of the problems of delivering additional information. But I think the most important thing is to make sure that we're aligned on the problem that we're trying to solve and what is going to be most effective in addressing it.
Thanks very much, Dr. Griego. Next, we have Sharon Sachs from FIND. We had a last-minute change in the program. Dr. Katrina Boume was unable to join. She's quite under the weather, so we hope she'll make a speedy recovery, but we're grateful that she sent her Director of Operations to represent FIND in her place, and we're very grateful to Sharon in particular for filling in really at the last minute. FIND is a product development partnership that focuses on diagnostics and covers a wide range of diseases: TB, malaria, hepatitis C, HIV. There's a new initiative, it seems, on AMR, an old initiative on sleeping sickness, and work more broadly on neglected tropical diseases and fever. So what I've asked Sharon to do is to provide some reflections on what all of these transparency debates might mean for a PDP. PDPs have been put forward as an alternate business model for R&D or a new business model. Does that mean that, that PDPs can take an alternate approach to transparency? Over to you.
Thank you, Siri. And let me start by saying that FIND is absolutely delighted to be collaborating on this subject today. We think it's really important. And as a PDP, we'd love to be more transparent. And we're all for transparency. But as has already been mentioned, we're a PDP. We rely entirely on partnerships. They're really important for us. It's our core of our business model. In any given year, we have about 150 active partnerships. And so there's always a fine line that PDPs walk in maintaining confidentiality with your partners and transparency. So just to have that as a sort of a scene setting. The two biggest challenges that PDPs, we believe, face, just to back up, just to say, we focus on products for low and middle income countries, and particularly diseases that are prevalent amongst the poorest populations. And so we're not talking about really robust markets and not very appealing markets here. And the two biggest challenges we face is getting commercial companies interested in developing products for our markets and keeping them interested, and then getting to a price point for the products that will be affordable for our target populations. We have found that increased transparency certainly has helped to stimulate innovation and product development. And I say that because PDPs certainly seek to make themselves available as knowledge platforms and to make themselves available for all stakeholders and interested parties. So examples of this would be, we take care to disseminate information. We publish target product profiles, mostly that have been developed in collaboration with WHO. So there are clear guidelines for product developers. We make available specimens through specimen banks that are openly available. We have access to knowledge on market understanding and the pathway to uptake for diagnostics in low and middle income countries. And all of that information certainly has helped pique interest from product developers for IVDs anyway. And for FIND, in terms of using transparency to optimize price points for our products, we've probably been less successful in that regard. We're very thorough in our contract negotiations and in defining the global access parameters in our contracts, but we've not really made it an inclusive process. And so by that I mean we haven't brought large global health procurers to the table to help us negotiate price points. And here it has to be done early in the R&D process. This is what we've discovered. This is a lesson learned. But we've seen progress in transparency amongst our partners, our commercial partners. Over the years, we found that industry has come to understand the need for being transparent around manufacturing cost and intellectual property, and which in our case is freedom to operate. Although so far it's mostly within the constraints of the PDP relationship, and so not very much of this information has been made publicly available. This is one area that we've not been very successful. But step by step, we've been able to convince partners to share information externally more readily. For example, clinical trial data. Even if it's negative clinical trial data, we'll publish it. And we make the metadata available. So refer to our policy on our website. We're up there, and we register our trials. And we've seen a few manufacturers, very few, agree to publish cost audits, to have them made and to have it made available publicly. And of course, that gives you information on the basis to their pricing model. But it's rare. One of the things I was asked to do was really to point out the fundamental differences between diagnostics and drugs and vaccines. And they really are quite different animals. For diagnostics, intellectual property patents, they form a huge part of the R&D costs for drugs, I believe. For diagnostics, it's not a big cost driver at all. It's important to secure freedom to operate, but the cost lies in know-how, around manufacturing know-how, and that's the main cost driver for diagnostics. Profits are marginal. Markup is really very small. When we negotiate contracts, we look for a COGS plus. It really is a minuscule markup. And the field is very competitive. So manufacturers are often unwilling to share sensitive information about their cost accounting. The diagnostic field is less mature, so there are no global manufacturers associations for diagnostics, and CEOs don't really gather and chat that often. You know, they don't hold round tables that often. So it's not a very conducive environment for transparency. This is something that we'd like to see changed. So the next part of the question was, what do we think the next steps are for diagnostics, for PDPs? What FIND will be doing is that we're going to try and encourage this transparency amongst IVD manufacturers. We're convening an IVD industry committee, and we hope to get them to huddle. And in that process, to discuss global health relevant IVD issues. We're piloting a different approach to pricing negotiations that involves procurers. So we're talking about global fund, big procurers, and to get them involved early on. And not after WHO recommendation on use, but well before that. And increasingly, we're seeking to bring academic and industry partners together in open and transparent consortia to work together to solve problems. For example, outbreak preparedness is a current example of that. We'd like to see an equivalent to the Access to Medicines Index for diagnostics. I think that would go very far to help to develop the kind of ecosystem that you need for sharing information. And I think that those are the key points that I want to make. For us, you know, the ultimate aims is to get the critical diagnostic products to the patients who need them. The patients for us are the end point. And so transparency just for transparency's sake is not something that we would advocate for, but where it's of value and where it can be done in a way that doesn't jeopardize industry's willingness to develop these products, yes, we're fully supportive of it.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I had originally promised my panelists that they would have a chance to respond to each other, but because I've not been the most strict timekeeper, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to actually open up the debate to the floor and to try to be fully transparent with all of you. So what I'd like to do is to invite any reactions, comments, questions from the floor. We have a ton of expertise here. I see the hands going up. Terrific. And as we get a round of comments on the floor, let me also invite Tanu up to join the panel in case anyone has questions or comments for him. So let's start here with Esteban from the Medicines Patent Pool. Then we'll go to the back. I think I see Ramin. I saw a hand here. 3. 4, and then 5. Okay, so we'll have to go in relatively rapid succession. And one more thing, we started about 10 minutes late, so I hope that we can go until about 4:40. Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you, Suri. So on the invite, I saw that one of the issues that was mentioned as a possible area for discussion was also transparency on patent status, which was not focus of a lot of the interventions that was mentioned in particular by Tenu, and thanks for that. But so one of the things that we realized at the Medicines Patent Pool when we started off was we needed to find out what was patented where in developing countries, and we couldn't find out that was almost impossible to find out. And the irony of the whole thing is that the actual word patent means to make open for public inspection. That's the original definition of the word, which basically means to make transparent. So the concept itself is let's make this information transparent. So it should be out there. And somehow we seem to have lost that. A lot of people have been making a lot of efforts in recent years to make that information more publicly available. We have our own database, which is MedSpal. It's on HIV, Hep C, and TB medicines. And it's focusing on low and middle income countries. And there's a number of other initiatives that have also tried to make that. And I think this is sort of a quite puzzling area where we regularly get calls from many of the leading procurement agencies, UNICEF, UNDP itself, others calling us, do you know if this product is patented or not? And it should be sort of a very basic question. But the answer gets bogged down very much into complexity. And I think it's another area where I would make a strong call for transparency. We're doing our little bit. We're now thinking about expanding our database into patented essential medicines. So not just these 3 diseases, but in low and middle income countries. But then patent transparency, data exclusivity transparency, licensing transparency, all these need to be part of the same sort of portal or basic information that by definition of the word itself should be transparent. Thank you. And I do think there's a lot of players that have made a lot of, and I do want to recognize industry's also made a lot of efforts in recent years to make that information increasingly more public. But we're all still working in a few disease areas, and I think we need to make that a lot wider. Thank you.
Thanks very much. 2 in the back, and then we'll go 3. Yes.
Thank you. Homir Zavi with CDA Foundation. So I'm on the nonprofit side, but I spent about 10 years in the industry. And I have to tell you, this whole conversation is absolutely shocking. You guys really need to hire people from the industry. Industry knows exactly what the competitors' prices are. You can go, there are an organization called IMS Health, Walter Kluwer, you can go and you can buy data on what the pricing is for every country, down to the state level. I know what the pricing is in St. Gallen. I know what the pricing is in Geneva, actually. This data is available. It's public information. You can just go buy it. If you're wondering about clinical trials, KMR, CMR, they are available. You can go Orange Book, Yellow Book. They publish it on a weekly basis. What are the clinical trials? How many clinical patients are in there? The problem is that the global health is isolated. You guys don't talk to anybody else. Wall Street, the finance sector. If you want to know what's going on in the healthcare industry, go talk to Deloitte & Touche, Goldman Sachs. Those guys know every drug development, how many patients are in the clinical trials, how much does it cost. This data is all available. You just don't know how to get it. Just ask people to get it. It's all available. The issue about pricing. Pricing has nothing to do with the cost. But let's just be upfront. It's value-based pricing. It's based on what the value is, and it will always be lower than the cost of gold standard. This was the golden rule in the industry. And I think the industry should be very upfront about this. This whole thing about Demasi, I completely agree. That was garbage, actually. That whole study was just worthless. And we keep bringing it up over and over. It has nothing to do with that. You look at what the cost of the gold standard is, the cost of doing nothing, and you price below that. Doesn't seem very fair, does it? But let's take everybody who's here is an MD gets paid more than a janitor. Yet you consume the same calories and it costs you the same for the housing, right? So your cost of goods is exactly the same as a janitor. So why does an MD get paid more? Because you add more value to the society. That's value-based pricing. In open markets, believe it or not, that's what's basis for Starbucks coffee, for McDonald's, everything is using value-based pricing. And the industry should be open about this. I don't know why we keep going around and around and it's always hidden. It's based, and that's why the prices are higher in Austria. Why are prices not more transparent? The governments don't want to They are the one that actually requested to keep it private. So if you remember, Spain didn't want to be part. There was discussion, and I was part. We have a procurement fund. We started a pool procurement fund to manage pricing actually globally now, and it's a nonprofit. But Spain, we were talking about poor procurement in the European Union. Spain didn't want to be part of it. Why? Because they already negotiated really, really low prices. They didn't want their prices known. They didn't want to be part of it. Governments play just as much role in this lack of transparency than organizations. But if you have questions regarding prices, there are lots of resources out there. When I was in the industry, I knew every clinical trial. I knew how much it cost, how many patients. I knew all the competitors' pricing. That stuff you can buy, and it's commercially available.
We are looking forward to a massive data dump into the public domain from you. Thank you. Excellent. So we had a third speaker here, fourth in the back, and then fifth up front. And then we'll see if we can do another round.
Thank you very much. My name is Mireille Velasquez. I'm from International Disability Alliance. And I have a question regarding products that the access to some products that might not necessarily be considered as medicine. So, for instance, one of the products that I'm thinking about is sunscreen, for instance. A lot of people have albinism, especially in the African continent. They are very sensitive to sunlight. They suffer discrimination even in their schools. There's a high dropout level, and very often they have to go out and work in the field. And that makes them even more vulnerable to sunlight as they have to work outside. That hampers their health and the amount of years they get to live. Because there is little access to sunscreen, as it is not considered a basic medicine. So I would like to know, by any chance, anyone in the panel knows about any plans or any discussions about making sunscreen accessible and to be counted as a basic medicine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then the woman in the back row. And then after that, we'll have Janice in the front row.
Thank you. My name's Kate Armstrong. I work for an Australian NGO helping children with chronic health conditions in resource-poor countries, and also chairing a task force on access to medicines through the Global Coalition NCD Child. I think the quote, transparency on what, accountability to whom, is a really great quote. I'm just wondering, thinking about communities of people living with NCDs, how can we make this information available in simple language that they can understand? We get requests all the time from doctors in multiple countries saying, how much are people paying in what country for what drugs? They just don't know. And so it's a word of mouth network that develops. But whether it's the EMLC or other sort of more centralised systems to really start getting some transparency out to the grassroots, to communities. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Janis Nats from the European Public Health Alliance, working in Brussels on advocacy on access to medicines. Two questions for Ms. Griego. Why should we believe you when you refer to value and outcomes-based schemes? Why should we believe the industry in this request to move towards a system that emphasizes these two parameters when your products that come onto the market in oncology, for instance, are ever increasing? And why should we buy this kind of arguments when they are relying on some preventative theoretical savings? And if we go down that path, maybe we should price vaccines or the traffic light or the midwife at millions of euros or hundreds of thousands of euros, because they save money from, they save lives and they save a lot of money from the healthcare systems. And the second question, since you have a member state representative next to you, I'm craving to hear from the industry what your feelings are towards initiatives in Europe that we see more and more, with the Benelux initiative being the most advanced, but other countries following up very quickly, like the recently signed Valletta Declaration in Malta. What does the industry, or what do the pharmaceutical industries, to be more precise, feel about this? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn back to our panel and see who would like to respond. We had a couple direct questions, of course, to Dr. Griego and Dr. Auer. And if there's any others who would urgently like to jump in, I'll give you the floor. But what I'd like to do is then squeeze in a second round, so I appreciate very concise responses. Yeah, we'll try to take a second round of comments, but first let's get a quick response from the panel.
Oh, well, when I started working on HIV issues, I contacted IMS and I asked them for some old price data actually on HIV drugs because we didn't think we could afford the current prices. We didn't really care about those. So they said, oh, $2,500. They give us a certain amount of African countries, for example, HIV drug prices. And then we said, well, we're going to put them on our webpage. And they said, oh, you can't do that. And I mean, I don't know if you're really aware of this, but some of these people that sell data and charge a lot of money for it don't eat it, take that data and just put it on the web. They make you sign contracts and stuff. So maybe you ought to spend a little time in my world.
Very quick responses. IP regulation is high on our agenda, but I'm a representative of a Ministry of Health. We don't have a clue. We never paid attention to IP regulation because it was always in other domains in government. We have to learn about it, but it's high on our agenda because we see the effects in the healthcare system. So we have to start talking closer to that. Sunscreen is a good topic. Come to Austria, I think you find a health insurance which might reimburse sunscreen. So it's if you have a medical condition on that. I'm not agreeing that the information is really available. You know, I think there are scientific institutions who are really working on prices and price transparency, and they don't know how to figure it out. Maybe they're stupid. Maybe they should talk to Goldman Sachs, but I doubt that they know all the prices. Because I have also a question to you: why is industry convincing reimbursers, social health insurances in Europe, or governments in Europe, to sign confidentiality clauses not to give the price public? You know, why is that? Why is that? There is no, you know, what is the incentive? You know, why are you doing this?
I think she needs the microphone, yeah.
Well, I think I have a lot to respond to.
I'm just adding to the list of, just to add to the list of things for you to respond to, because you didn't have enough to work on. So I think something that you alluded to, I want to clarify. So in the clinical trials transparency spectrum, it's really important to distinguish registration, transparency about what is happening, when it finished, and then reporting the results, which has no privacy and has no legitimate confidentiality issues. Anonymization doesn't come into that. And our joint statement from last week is referring to reporting the summary results. Beyond that is the IPD discussion, which is legitimately more complex. And this is why we don't have global agreement. The norms and standards haven't reached consensus at the global level yet about individual level participant data sharing. There are issues with privacy and potential re-identification, which is not to say that there are not, I think there is general agreement that there is likely public health gains if we can figure out the best ways to move forward with IPD sharing. And some of the funders are already taking this on. The Gates Foundation is now, as many of you would know, require that the actual IPD is made available at the time of publication for clinical trials that they fund. And then there's the clinical study reports, the very large regulatory filings. So both the clinical study reports and the data are much more complex issues in terms of transparency for us than the results. And there are no legitimate reasons that we see for not disclosing the results in a timely fashion. And I want to applaud the groups that are moving forward the more complex issues around IPD and clinical study reports. EMA has a very progressive position on access to clinical study reports, which I find it troubling that there's a court case right now where a couple of industry groups have taken EMA to court to try to block access to the clinical study reports. So there's a sort of a trade versus public health issue playing out in the courts right now, and I think the outcome of that is going to be very important.
Thank you. Dr. Griego, would you like to respond to some of the questions?
And again, I'll say that there's a bit of balance in the that needs to be achieved between confidential business information and the public health benefits from disclosing information, and for price. So you know what I think, if you look at what happens when price is disclosed, you have a number of countries who do reference pricing, and it's one thing if you look at comparable countries and take the average, but when the price setting that a country does is based on find the lowest price and set the lowest price, I think then we have an issue where there are a number of countries who are more affluent than others, basically benefiting from that lower price, which was intended for a lower income country. So that is part of the problem, if you will, that we are trying to work with payers to address.
But why Germany? Why did you force almost Germany to put it into law? You didn't succeed, Industry didn't succeed, but why Germany? I can understand Albania.
I can't speak to the specifics of that discussion, but you know, but I think so. Regardless of that, going back to your question, we're an evidence-based industry. We have to prove our safety, efficacy, and before it's even allowed to be marketed. And beyond that, whether it's a private payer in the US or public payers in Europe, there is an assessment in terms of what is the added benefit that we're bringing. And so there is that discussion, and our negotiation with payers are based on that information. And so yes, I absolutely believe that the pricing should be based on value, and we're already delivering on that. And I think what we're working on is really looking at the broader impact that the medicines that we deliver have on the healthcare system. And to the extent we are improving the outcomes, I think we are waiting and ready to work with payers in order to make those arrangements possible. But I think it really depends on a country level what the current system is and what's available in terms of making those arrangements.
So we are, I did promise another round of questions, but I think it's been very valuable to hear from the speakers. What I'd like to propose is that each of the panel members gets 1 minute to either propose an action step or respond to others, but we need to be very concise in order to wrap up on time. We can start here with Tenu and then go down the line. And then I hope that all of these conversations can continue in the Twitter sphere, in person, et cetera, because it's certainly a huge and complex topic.
Right. Thanks, Suri. Very quickly, value-based pricing. Maybe I don't understand it, but let's try this example. I leave this conference room. I hail a taxi. I say, I need to get to the airport now because I need to catch a flight or else this $5 million deal I have is going to go down the tubes. Taxi driver says, well, that will be $50,000. Why? Because that's 1% of what you would stand to benefit if you caught your flight. Right? If that's the case, then I can see why people don't like value-based pricing. Very quickly on governments. I think governments are as much a part of the problem as they are part of a solution. I think the high-level panel referred a number of its recommendations to governments as duty bearers because they do sign confidentiality agreements because they get better deals than their neighbors, and you know, that's part of the problem, this cloak of secrecy. And then very quickly also to say that policy coherence is another thing that comes through very strongly in the high-level panel report. because we need about 7 or 8 line ministries under the coordination of the executive working to address health technology, innovation, and access issues, ranging from trade negotiations to price setting to transparency issues to R&D across the whole gamut. It's not the responsibility of one or the other. It's literally a range of 7 or 8.
Very concise action points, please, from each speaker.
Great. And I think, you know, if we look to the future, the drivers of healthcare cost is going to be chronic disease, and there are a number of still unmet needs. So for me, looking at solutions, finding those interventions that are going to be helpful in reducing that burden of disease to build on the progress that we have now are critical issues. And so to the extent different types of transparency can help with that, I think that's great to work together towards that. But I think what we really need to look at is fundamentally what are the key barriers to access to medicines in developing countries. And it really is, in that case, health systems reform, healthcare financing, and those basic things that are right now making generic essential medicines unreachable. And so unfortunately, the types of transparencies we've talked about does not address that problem. And so I think this is an opportunity now for everyone to come together and address those key drivers of access to medicines barriers. And unfortunately, again, this type of transparency does not help with that.
Action point, I would love to bring together the management of public research funds with health people to talk about prioritization of funding of research, because we don't even know what we publicly fund in research. There is no database available for that, not on the European level, not on the national level. I would love to bring these people in one room so that we can exchange the needs we all have.
I want to reiterate the idea that this is a ripe area for countries to join together in norm setting. It's always very difficult for an individual country, an individual PDP. I know that DNDi won't release its licensing practices, the WHO won't release its licenses, the NIH won't release its, all these different parties that individually feel that it's not in their interest to be more transparent, even though they wish everyone else would. And there's kind of a collective action problem. Collectively, you can make more sensible policies on things. And it's a good idea to really do it to engage in this conversation so that people kind of move together. I just want to say on the value-based pricing, which has been used in all sorts of environments, including on the cancer resolution, where last Friday transparency was eliminated from the resolution in terms of R&D cost. Well, it wasn't eliminated, but it was watered down to the point where you have to sort of, someone has to guide you through to see where it is now. But if you think about value-based pricing for a rare disease, it doesn't make any sense. You have diseases where the price is $200,000 a year, $300,000, $500,000, $700,000, in some cases $1 million a year. That's not a value-based pricing thing. Why are the prices so high in those cases? Is because people believe it's necessary to do what? To reward people from having made investments in R&D. And then you get to the other side where you have hepatitis C, or increasingly HIV, which has a large living population these days, prostate cancer, breast cancer, where you have large patient those are budget busting products because they have a lot of patients. And why are they budget busting? Not because whatever you think, you start multiplying $100,000 a year toward a lot of people that are not being cured. In the case of cancer, a lot of times that busts the budget. So I think that you have to, at some point, if the whole reason for high prices is because you think you're stimulating R&D, you have to just stop saying, well, it's all about value and it's all about pricing. You have to ask yourself, out of $1 trillion, how much is the monopoly costing you and what are you getting back, and figure out whether or not it's a smart policy or a stupid policy. I think the attacks on transparency are protecting the status quo. And if you want to change the status quo, you can't do it if you don't have any information. If investors need information, the SEC requires them to disclose the licenses, the royalty terms, revenues, by quarter, by market segment, by geographic segment. If it's material to investors, there is transparency. If it's material to patients, maybe yes, maybe no. I think you have to change that. You need the same status that investors has. If it's material to you, you should have it.
Thanks. So, access to information. Access to information about clinical trial results. So this is an area where one of the features has been that at multiple points, people have said, now this is fixed. In 2007, they said it was fixed when there was a US law. At various other points, people have said it's fixed. It's not fixed. But I think it's a really interesting time because it seems like it could be a moment in terms of clinical trials transparency right now. Because if you look at the key stakeholder groups, there is at least one big globally relevant, sometimes dominant player, whether you're a government research funder or a multinational pharmaceutical company or a transnational regulator that has adopted and is enforcing the international accepted norms on clinical trial transparency, which are not controversial. Our 2015 position that we put out for consultation was supported by industry. We had comments that we received from IFPMA, was supported by many of the academic groups that we received comments from. We received 744 comments. So we have general agreement about how to proceed. There are actions that are out there on our website. You can look at our joint statement. This is not coming from us, it's coming from the international community. And so I am, although I'm by nature a pessimist, I am in this space guardedly optimistic that we will be able to make progress in the next few years.
And now we come to the kindergarten corner because, for PDPs and for fines, certainly this whole subject matter, we're very new to it. And when I say for FIND, I think, so speaking as a PDP, what I think the next steps would be, what the next action would be most important for us would be to get a sense of how this dialogue that certainly seems to be escalating and that has been primarily focused on high-income countries and products that are accessible in high-income countries, how this translates into and how it impacts on commercial companies and organizations such as ours who are targeting low-income countries, and how we can navigate that fine line so that we're very careful about how we approach transparency and what we land up insisting on. Where we come from, we actually insist that all the prices are published on our website, all the prices that are available to low and middle income countries. So all of that information is really quite readily available and it's contractually defined for us. So I think what I would like to see is more discussion and a better understanding for us how the greater global discussion on this can be incorporated into our model without having too significant a negative impact.
Thank you very much. So it's certainly a lot of interest, as evidenced by all of you, in this theme of transparency. Certainly not sufficient to fully address innovation and access challenges, but many people have made the argument that it could very well be necessary. I do think this is an issue that's here to stay. I would like to thank Irene Proyas, without whom we could not have organized this event, and the whole team at the Global Health Center. I would like to thank the audience for excellent participation and your presence. And last but not least, please join me in thanking the panelists.